My role as it relates to research is primarily on food safety, salmonella, the sugar toxin producing E. coli, and then antimicrobial drug resistance. And through this work, I get to interact with a lot of stakeholders all the way along the farm to fork continuum in food animal production, if you will. And these stakeholders vary from producers to veterinarians to public health agencies as well as advocacy groups. And certainly it is apparent to me and self-apparent to me that the awareness of this interconnectedness of animal health, of human health and environmental health is continuing to grow. And as you've heard, this is captured under that umbrella term of One Health. And certainly as we begin to understand this One Health approach, the opportunities for dialogue such as today, but also ongoing true productive collaboration continue to grow. And we can look for many examples of where this has been successful. And I will draw from an example that is closer to the work that I do, is probably less One Health applicable, but certainly is an analogy that I think we can work from. And that is from the food safety crises that E. coli 0157 presented in the mid-90s and early 2000s. Certainly, this is slightly different than the true One Health paradigm, but there was a shared crisis, a shared problem, and a shared desire to place an outcome that wanted to be achieved. And through the coordinated action of the public health agencies and the animal production industry, particularly the beef industry, we now see that ground beef contamination has decreased more than 90%. The human incidence of E. coli 0157 has decreased more than 50%. So certainly there are examples that we can draw from successes. And there are lots of other similarities that we can identify when we work in a One Health dialogue, if you will. We see between veterinarians and MDs that we share a lot of similarities in the rigor of the training. In terms of practice, there's a lot of similarities in the regulations under which we can operate. And also, too, the tools that we have at our disposal, whether they're diagnostic tools or they're pharmaceutical tools, are approved with a similar rigor of approval process by the appropriate regulatory authority. So we do have a lot in common, we do have a lot of shared values. But what I'd like to highlight is that in some instances we do have differences, and differences of shared different values. And these values, where they differ, I think become very important to evaluate, because if we don't evaluate and consider them, they may become barriers to implementation. And I'll give you an example. I had the privilege of presenting some work that looked at a particular tool that could reduce E. coli 0157 in groups of cattle. When I presented that to a group of MDs, including pediatric gastroenterologists, one of them commented, for $10, how could you not implement this tool? In their view, this was a social norm that should be done. I gave the same presentation to a group of consultant veterinarians, and I explained that it was $10, all the cost would be borne by the producer, the benefit by the consumer. And one of the most influential veterinary consultants said, we can only be so generous. And I think these are very divergent values, but represent their obligation to their clients and their patients. And what I think we ought to do is we need to consider that while these are very different values, they're both very valid. They're both reasoned through tremendous experiential reflection on their practice and their obligations to their clients. And I think we need to view these divergent values as both having legitimacy in designing programs that would be quite effective. Unfortunately, we tend to gravitate to our own groups, and we gravitate to the values that we tend to associate with. And so if I can diverge into another example, the use of antimicrobial drugs in animal production is clearly a contentious issue. But I think if we are able to make progress on the dialogue about the appropriateness of certain uses and where uses are appropriate and judicious, I think we have to do a number of things. We have to accept and consider different values. For instance, I think we have to accept and consider that with any application of a pharmaceutical, whether that be an antimicrobial or not, there are potential risks associated with that to the animals as well as potentially to consumers, but there are also benefits of those uses. And too often we gravitate to either the risks or the benefits, where really it's the net benefit against the net risks to society that we ought to consider. And this leads to something that Congressman Schrader said, the demagoguery that's associated with this discussion. And I believe a lot of this comes from the fact that we generally don't consider a wide range of values, particularly diverse values. And here is, I think, where the opportunity lies as we continue this dialogue in a One Health approach. We ought to consider that there are competing values and that those competing values are no less legitimate than the values that we hold. And I think if we can do that, then the programs that we develop under a One Health approach have a much better chance to be successful.